Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, you've given us a stack of sources that basically throws modern law, ancient philosophy, and digital information control all into a blender.
It does. So our job is to try and make sense of what comes out. We're dissecting a legal case that became, well, it's surprising, but it became a philosophical battlefield.
It's really something. We've been working through this fascinating, and I have to say, pretty troubling collection of materials.
Yeah, they really run the gamut. On one hand, you have these very formal, very dry legal documents, the prosecution statement, the defense appeal, the final ruling.
And on the other,
On the other, you have these incredibly intense analytical essays from scholars who looked at this modern trial and saw a direct, almost tragic mirror of history.
so the person we're talking about today is a scholar, Dr. Chen-Jing Yuan. But he's not a political scientist, not a historian. He has a PhD in nonlinear complex systems theory.
Which is what makes this so strange. In
Right.
2022, he was arrested in Kunming and then sentenced to 20 months in prison for picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
That's the Sungsan Zishizu.
Exactly. And it was all because of things he posted, things he forwarded, and comments he made over 3 years on an overseas social media platform.
It's the dissonance here that makes this case so important for you to understand.
It really is. I mean, you have a highly educated academic who specializes in things like esoteric mathematics and physics being convicted of this vaguely defined street crime.
A crime that's usually for, like, physical fights or brawls.
Exactly, not for digital expression. So our goal today is to dive deep into two things. First, how the court legally constructed this idea of a guilty mind and public chaos out of, just social media posts.
And second, why the analysis keeps coming back to this parallel between a 21st century case and the trial of Socrates from 2,400 years ago.
Let's start with the hard facts. Dr. Chen, he was an independent scholar. He gets arrested in September 2022.
And the post they cited went back years, right?
All the way back to 2019. He's finally convicted and sentenced in April 2023, and his appeal, which was not public, was rejected just a month later. The 20-month sentence was confirmed.
So what was the prosecution's actual argument here? They couldn't just say we don't like his posts. They needed a very specific charge.
They did, and they settled on picking quarrels. The Kunming procurator had to establish 3 core legal elements for that crime.
Okay, what were they?
First, he was accused of using flying software, to get onto overseas networks.
Oh, VB.
Basically. Second, he allegedly spread false remarks, or Zujia Yanlin. And third, and this is the crucial part, these remarks had to have caused severe chaos to public order.
Okay, so let's break that down. The false remarks part. In any criminal case involving speech, the prosecution has to prove a guilty mind or mens rea.
Right. And in this case, that subjective intent is called Mingji. They had to prove he knew the posts were false when he shared them.
And this is where the whole thing just takes a wild turn that the analyst we read just couldn't believe.
No, because the prosecution, they didn't have any direct evidence. I mean, how could you? You can't prove what's going on inside someone's head. So they used a completely different line of reasoning to prove Mingji.
The infamous high education presumption.
Exactly. The court explicitly argued that because Dr. Chen had a PhD, he should possess higher cognitive levels. And from that,
They just jumped to the conclusion that he must have known the information was false.
they weaponized his academic identity against him.
The irony is it's staggering. The court is creating a legal argument based on who he is, on his profession, rather than on any objective evidence of his intent.
And it creates such a dangerous legal precedent. Commentators pointed out this effectively creates a kind of identity-based guilt. The more capable you are of complex thought, the more responsible you are for just forwarding something that might be questionable.
It completely flips the whole idea of subjective intent on its head. It replaces it with this idea of a presumed cognitive duty.
Yeah, a superior cognitive duty. And if we look at how this all wrapped up, the appellate ruling from the Kunming Intermediate People's Court is just as revealing.
They decided not to hold an open trial for the appeal. Why was it rejected?
This is the key phrase from the ruling. The court stated he failed to submit new evidence to disprove the original charge.
Wait. Think about what that means. The burden of proof was completely reversed.
Completely. Instead of the prosecution having to prove the crime again, the falsity, the intent, the chaos, Dr. Chen, who's already in jail, was somehow expected to prove his own innocence.
That flies in the face of, fundamental legal due process that the analyst cited. The state is supposed to prove you're guilty, not the other way around.
It just solidifies the error. The initial presumption of guilt based on his education was then locked in by an appellate court that essentially gave up its duty to review the case.
But the sources tell us the real story here is in the defense itself, so let's move into that. Dr. Chen's response, written while he was incarcerated, the blood letter.
It's a remarkable document. Just remarkable. He didn't just deny the crime. He took apart the three elements of the charge piece by piece, starting with the element of falsity.
So what was his defense against the claim? His posts were just false rumors.
He argued that his posts, which were mostly forwards and comments, they fell into three categories that should be excluded. He said they were either art or symbolism, subjective emotion, or rational understanding and opinion.
And the legal argument there is that falsity requires a truth-apt statement, something that can actually be proven true or false.
Precisely. So if you share a political cartoon, or you express frustration, or you just offer a theory, those things legally can't be rumors because they aren't factual claims to begin with. They're non-falsifiable.
The critique we reviewed points out that the authorities just deliberately blurred that line. They refused to make that really fundamental philosophical distinction between a fact and a viewpoint.
And by doing that, they weaponize the whole concept of false information to shut down critical discussion.
It's a profound challenge. It forces the legal system to admit there are limits to its own jurisdiction over facts. Okay, let's turn to the next element, Mingzi. The knowing intent that the court just assumed he had because of his PhD.
Right. How did he fight that? Well, this is where ancient philosophy first makes a direct appearance in his defense.
Really? In a legal document?
In the legal document, Dr. Chen denied Mingzi by asserting what scholars call epistemic humility. He basically said, look, like any citizen, I'm not all-knowing. I'm not a professional intelligence analyst.
And he used one of the most famous analogies in all of philosophy to make his point.
He did. He specifically referenced Plato's cave allegory to frame himself as just a prisoner chained in the cave.
The implication being, how can any ordinary person who only gets fragmented and controlled information ever definitively know the absolute truth or falsity of every single thing they see online?
It's more than just a denial. It's a critique of the entire information environment. He's arguing that the ordinary citizen has no legal obligation to conduct professional-grade fact-checking.
He says that's the state's job.
Absolutely. If anyone has that duty, it's the public safety and network administration bodies. They have the resources, the authority. To hold a private citizen to that standard is to impose an impossible burden.
Okay, so let's move to the third piece of his defense, the result. Severe chaos. The prosecution's claim was that his few scattered posts caused this massive public collapse.
And this is where his expertise in complex systems theory really comes into play. He argued that his low-impact, sparse posts couldn't possibly have caused the kind of catastrophic avalanche mechanism needed for real social chaos.
And to prove this, he brought up his own field of expertise, nonlinear propagation, and something called the CAP theorem.
He did.
Okay, we have to pause here because the CAP theorem is, that's highly technical stuff. It's usually for computer systems. How is that relevant here?
Right, so to simplify, the CAP theorem basically says that in a distributed system like the internet, you can only have two of three things at the same time: consistency, availability, and partition tolerance. The point is that perfect, instant, nonlinear spread is just inherently impossible in a vast, fragmented system.
I think I see. So he's drawing an analogy. Just like a computer network has built-in limits on how fast information can spread, social media itself inherently resists the kind of instantaneous, total social panic you'd need for severe chaos.
That's it exactly. His posts, he argued, were just sparse, low-impact noise in a huge system. They weren't the signal you'd need to trigger a massive, predictable wave of chaos. And, crucially, the sources confirm the prosecution offered zero objective evidence of actual chaos.
No riots, no panic, no real-world disruption.
Nothing. Zero.
So you have this defense that systematically shows the content wasn't a factual claim, he didn't have the legal duty to know it was false, and even if he did, it demonstrably didn't cause the required damage, and he was still convicted.
And that failure of the system to protect basic expression, even criticism of the state, is why the analysts we read brought in their critiques so much. They called out the use of this pocket crime, an ambiguous law you can stretch to punish almost anything.
And the violation of the constitutional right to criticize.
Right. The verdict, they argued, wasn't a legal judgment. It was a political condemnation of just asking questions.
And this is where the story shifts from a legal process to, well, a philosophical tragedy. The moment Dr. Chen asserted his intellectual humility, The sources connect him directly to the 2,400-year-old trial of Socrates.
The parallels are they're stark, they're almost chilling. Socrates was condemned for corrupting the youth and impiety, these vague charges that were just a cover for the authorities' fear of his constant questioning.
And Dr. Chen was condemned for trouble and false remarks.
A modern digital age veil for suppressing unapproved ideas. Both of them, these two scholars, were punished not for an action, but for their thoughts, for their persistent inquiry.
Which brings us to that famous Socratic role, the gadfly. What does that image mean here?
Socrates called himself the gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the noble but lazy horse, which was Athens, to keep it awake. Dr. Chen's defense is cast as the modern gadfly, trying to sting the legal and political system out of its unexamined blindness.
The gadfly serves a necessary, even if it's an annoying function, forcing self-reflection.
And that denial of Mingzi, the knowing intent that we talked about, that becomes the absolute heart of the Socratic echo. Dr. Chen is essentially channeling Socrates' most famous principle, I know that I know nothing. Exactly. When the court used his high education to presume knowledge, they were punishing his intellectual humility. The sources argue Socrates taught that true wisdom is knowing your own limits. The judges, who claimed they could determine the absolute truth of everything, were practicing what Socrates would call false wisdom.
They claimed certainty where a true scholar was asserting doubt.
And so the ultimate condemnation of the court goes beyond just flawed logic. It becomes a moral judgment. It reflects the Socratic choice for virtue over, simple survival.
This is the moral core of the whole analysis, isn't it?
It is. Socrates chose death over abandoning his mission. He said he would obey the god rather than you. Dr. Chen's choice to write that detailed blood letter and just persistently deny the charge, he refused a plea bargain. That embodies the Socratic belief that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice.
He chose principle over expediency. It paints this picture of a state that is just fundamentally afraid of critical self-examination.
That is the core philosophical critique in these documents. The case demonstrates a state that refuses to examine its own use of power, rushing instead to convict. It's a modern application of the Socratic idea. The unexamined state is not worth ruling.
So what does all of this whole deep dive mean for you, the person just trying to stay informed in an age of, intense information warfare? We've seen a legal process just defined by voids in evidence and flawed logic, and it's amplified by this profound philosophical condemnation of suppressing inquiry itself.
The essential takeaway here is the crucial distinction that Dr. Chen tried to force the court to recognize. The difference between a verifiable fact and a protected viewpoint, opinion, or artistic expression. If the law fails to protect expression that is just critical or uncomfortable, then the concept of a rumor becomes a targeted legal weapon against ideas.
So we'll leave you with this final thought. If virtue truly is knowledge, as Socrates argued, and Dr. Chen's highly rational and reasoned defense reveals a high degree of knowledge and philosophical virtue, what does the verdict of guilty reveal about the virtue of the system that chose to punish him for pursuing and expressing that knowledge? That is a fundamental question for you to continue to examine long after this deep dive is over.